Gentlemen, on behalf of Bond Head United Church and all of the churches in the cluster, South Simcoe cluster, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come out on a not too frosty Saturday morning and enjoy some time of fellowship and camaraderie and a little bit of education, hopefully. I'll try not to bore you too much. Can everyone see this screen, first of all? Make sure you're in a position to see the screen there. And so just before I get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Rob Murdock, and I'm the minister at St. James United in Stroud. And I'm a diaconal minister, which may require some explanation, and I'll probably get to that throughout my talk this morning. But I've been there since I graduated from the Center for Christian Studies in Winnipeg in April, and I was called to that ministry in May, and have been there ever since, and having a great time. And I'll tell you all about that journey as I go through my talk. So thank you again for being here, and I want to thank Patty Rogers, Pastor Patty, for inviting me here. And I understand there was a couple of you fellows to blame for this that went up to St. John in Alliston, where I did this talk back in November, who asked to see if I could come down here and repeat the same thing. So I'm going to try. Now there are a couple of pictures off to the side here, and through the morning, if you wander over and have a look at those. The one on the bulletin board there is that Patty's holding up right now is a picture of me at a homicide scene, actually with my partner, who's now a sergeant with Toronto Police, and a particularly gruesome and terrible scene where a young woman was killed by her boyfriend. And just to show you the kinds of things that we did as forensic investigators. And the unusual picture at the bottom that people are just scratching their heads at is actually me. And that picture was taken on May
18th.
May 18th, 1973, when I applied to become a cadet with the Toronto Police. And I was 17 years old at that point. I wasn't even 18 at that time. Had graduated high school, and it's the only picture in the world that exists with me with long hair. And so I didn't even know it existed. When I retired, the unit that I retired from, the forensic unit, actually go back into the archives and they collect your recruit picture. And I didn't even know that picture existed, because that afternoon I went out and got my hair cut, and it's been short, not quite as short as it is right now, because right now it's disappearing. But at any rate, that's where we are. So I'm here to talk about my journey from policing into ministry, and already my table companions and I had a little chat as we were sitting there this morning enjoying a wonderful breakfast, and people were asking me, how on earth did you go from being a cop to being a minister? And hopefully this will explain some of that to you. So I'm going to go through the whole story, and maybe by the end of the story you'll appreciate how it is that I walked this journey that I walked. And so we have the PowerPoint here, and I'm going to just click it on to the next picture there. And as you can see, this is the police officer's oath of office. And you can see the words there about solemnly swearing to uphold the law and to serve the community and to serve the greater good. Think about those words when you see what St. Peter said in regards to being good stewards and serving God and serving your community. And really, I don't think there's much difference. I jokingly say to my friends, I spent the first half of my working career locking up bad guys, and I'm going to spend the last half of it trying to save them. And so right off the bat, you can see that there are some similarities in service, because service is really at the heart of what we do. And service comes up quite a bit, and you will know by the end of this talk why I am a diaconal minister, because diaconia, being in service to God and the community, is really what diaconia is all about. So my journey. there's 3 pictures there. One of them's a little boy, in case you can't see all the way up to the front there, who's leaning on a table looking at a nativity scene. And really that was my first connection with the divine, with God. I grew up in a Roman Catholic household. My father was a World War II veteran. He was a Royal Engineer who spent 7 years in Europe. He signed up in 39 and didn't come home till 46, because as an engineer he stayed afterwards and helped to rebuild Holland and Belgium. And so when he was there, though, he met a beautiful young Dutch lady, and so they got married, and he sent her back home to Canada, and then of course came back, and so they renewed their marriage, and they lived in Toronto. He's originally from the Prescott area, but they moved to Toronto because he worked for Canada Wire and Cable as an engineer. My dad worked for Canada Wire for many, many years. And so I grew up in the east end of Toronto, just north of the beaches, if you know the Toronto area, just off the Danforth, and grew up with a lot of Italian and Greek friends that were Roman Catholic. And so my first taste of spirituality was in the Roman Catholic faith. And of course I should mention at this point that the Dutch war bride and the Canadian soldier did not have me as a child. I was adopted. They discovered very soon into their marriage that they were unable to have children, and so I fortunately was adopted. And I'll get back to that part of my story perhaps a little bit later. So my first connection to the divine, as I said, was with the Catholic Church, and I can recall my first connection of feeling some sort of relationship with God was especially at Christmas time. And I can remember sitting in front of the fireplace. That's not a picture of a fireplace, but I was sitting in front of the fireplace with the nativity scene off to the side, and my parents had one of those old record players that was in a whole big cabinet thing. The older guys will probably remember those, with the 33 1/3 and the 78s and all of those kinds of discs, and listening to Christmas music and singing in a plaintive little voice, as Dickens would say, in a plaintive little voice, the Christmas carols, and especially The Little Drummer Boy was my favorite, and for some reason crying. And I felt a real connection whenever I would sing these songs and would talk about the birth of baby Jesus, that there was somehow a connection there. And so I recall that very vividly, and that was my first real connection to my faith. The next connection to my faith is St. Bridget's Roman Catholic Church, which is the picture on the right there, and that's a Roman Catholic church that's situated around Woodbine and Danforth in the east end of Toronto, and that's where my father was the head usher, very actively involved in the community of faith there. And I went to St. Bridget's School, which was run by the nuns. And there's my nun friend at the bottom there, looking very stern with a ruler. And that's my second connection, really, to something to do with faith, because when I was 6 years old, I was caught in the girls' schoolyard, and I was playing tag with the boys, and the boys played too rough, so we divided the schoolyard into half. One half for the boys, one half for the girls. But us rebels, we would run into the girls' schoolyard to try and avoid being tagged. And I got caught when the nun would come out and ring the bell, and everyone had to stop. And so you and you into the principal's office, and so that is a representation of the principal, who was a nun, and unfortunately it wasn't a ruler that she disciplined me with, it was the strap. And so you can imagine, in this day and age, a 6-year-old boy being forced to stand there with his hand out, and this nun, and I kid you not, when I tell this story, people go, no way. This nun got up on a chair and leaped off that chair like a ninja and came down with that strap and strapped me once on the hand. Just once, but it hurt. And of course I daren't tell my parents, because then I'd get it at home too for being in the girls' schoolyard. But that was my first connection to discipline within the church. Thank goodness the United Church doesn't have a strap. We're very fortunate. But I carried on with the United Church, with the Roman Catholic faith for some time. And my journey continued in faith. When I left the Roman Catholic Church in what year would that be? 1970, I guess. I was born in 55, so 15 years of age. Yes, 1970, 1971. I was still drawn to faith, and so you can see there, trying to picture what we've got here. We've got the Holy Bible here on the left. We've got the Bhagavad Gita, we've got the Talmud, we've got the Quran, and we've got the enlightened path of the Buddha. So all of those books of faith, I was drawn to them. In fact, I was drawn originally to Greek and Norse mythology. And so I read everything I could on Zeus and Jove and Thor and all of those gods of myth from all of those cultures, because I was still interested in a connection to the divine. And so I continued my faith journey. And as I said, when I had my children, I got married. I got married in the United Church, and my wife and I had a son, and then we had a daughter, and we decided we were going to move to Tottenham. So I moved to Tottenham. Now, in the meantime, of course, I had joined the Toronto Police Service. And so at age 18, as you saw from that picture at the bottom there, I had attended at the headquarters, which at that time was at 590 Jarvis Street, the old IOOF building, Jarvis and Bloor, and went in and applied. And when the sergeant looked at me with that hair and said, "Go out and get your hair cut," I went out and got my hair cut. And so I joined as a cadet. They don't have the cadet program anymore. That was for men under the age, and women under the age of 21. Although we didn't really hire a lot of women. Believe it or not, we had a rule on the Toronto Police Service that we had as many women police officers as we had horses. I don't know where they come up with that rule, but we had about 90 horses, and so we had about 90 police women. And there was well over 1,500 police men. And my question was, what happens if a horse dies? Do we have to put down a policewoman? No one ever answered me on that. So time went on, and as a cadet, I got to learn a lot about policing. I worked in the division. I worked in the division that's now at the foot of the Allen Expressway, Eglinton and the Allen Expressway, 13 Division. And I got a wonderful opportunity to learn about police work without having any of the stress of being a police officer. I was more or less a civilian, and although I wore a uniform, and I got used very early to wearing a uniform. At one point in my career, at that point, my inspector had transferred to the downtown division, 52 Division, and he'd been looking as a favor to the chief to replace a cadet at the headquarters unit or the employment office. Because at that time, 1974, if you recall your history, Toronto Police went to a two-man car. And up until that point, we never had two-man cars, or two-person cars. We only had one officer working in a car all night. And so we basically had to double our force. And so we were in a real hiring binge. And so we needed someone at the headquarters unit to help with this massive recruiting drive. And so I was selected, and I went to headquarters and had a wonderful opportunity to be involved with the hiring of a lot of different police officers. We hired police officers from all across the British Commonwealth. At that time, you had to be 21 years of age to be a constable. You had to have grade 12 and actually grade 11, believe it or not, in those days. You had to be 5'8", 160 pounds, good vision, and a clean criminal record, and you had to be either a Canadian citizen or a landed immigrant from a British Commonwealth country. And so we hired a lot of police officers that came from the UK, came from Singapore, came from Hong Kong, came from right across the world, and it was a wonderful opportunity to get to meet a lot of different men of different backgrounds. And so I did that until I turned 21, and then off I went to the Ontario Police College, which I returned to years later, which I'll get to. And that's down in Aylmer. All police officers in Ontario have to go to the Ontario Police College. The individual services do their own training, but they have to get their ticket with the Ontario government, and you have to graduate from the OPC, the Ontario Police College, in Aylmer, which was an old Air Force base. And they sold it to the government for $1, and they turned it into the Ontario Police College. And when I went, it was an old barracks that we slept in. Now they've got luxury accommodations and their own rooms and their own, a shared bathroom facility with 4 or 5 other fellows. But back in those days, it was just a big barn. And so that was the recruiting, or the experience of education that I got. And when I finished, I went back to 13 Division, the division that I had started at, for my field training. And I thought, okay, I'm going to end up in 13 Division as a constable. And then when the list came out for where I was going to go as a constable, brand new, full of spit and vinegar, ready to attack the world and save the world from bad guys, and they sent me to traffic. Traffic means you have to ride a motorcycle. I had never even sat on a motorcycle. And so they called me in the first day and said, there you go, there's a 750-pound Harley Davidson, and that's what you're going to learn on. And the Harley Davidsons that we drove in those days had a suicide stick shift and a foot clutch that you had to rock back and forth. So as you're driving along, you had to take your hand off the steering column and actually change gears. Now the guys that were like Roland's height, you could do it with your knee, the big tall guys, but us little short guys, we had to take our hands off and drive with one hand. So it was quite something. And in the winter time, we put a sidecar on the motorcycles, and we went out in weather like we've had this week. I can clearly recall riding the motorcycle and stopping people for going through red lights or crosswalks, and asking permission if I could sit in their car and write them their ticket, because my pen would freeze out on the street. And believe it or not, people would let me. And so it was quite an experience in riding those motorcycles. I ended up with arthritis in both my hands as a result, and so now here in my late 60s, I now wear hearing aids as a result of being out on the street with those motorcycles. But other than that, it was a wonderful experience. And so I was doing all of that, and a young married man, and in the meantime, I moved to Tottenham. So my police career there, 1973 as a cadet, and I'll just kind of jump from my personal life to the policing career for just a second. 1973, I was a cadet. 1976, I became a constable. But I was always interested because my family had always dreamed that I was going to be a doctor. I had graduated grade 13 at 16 years of age. I had skipped twice in school and had done quite well. And all of my family, my dad was an engineer, but all of my aunts and uncles and relations were all in the medical field. And so I was supposed to be a doctor. But I joined the police force and quickly fell in love with doing that kind of work. And so the scientific application of policing was always attractive to me. So I became a hit-and-run investigator, of course using some science to investigate hit-and-run collisions. I became a breathalyzer technician, and in what year was this now? 1980, I did the most breathalyzer tests in all of Canada. It was quite a bad year. I did over 330 breathalyzer tests in 1 year. And the drinking and driving problem was just as bad then as it is now, unfortunately. And then after a few years in traffic, I wanted to be a real, what we used to call in those days, a BCD, a big city detective. And so to do that, I had to go back to the division. And so I went back to 13 Division, where I had been originally hired and worked, and very quickly got into the detective office as a detective constable. And so, of course, the first thing that they make you investigate is the thing that's the biggest pain for anybody who does not like mathematics, and that was frauds. And so I ended up investigating a bunch of very complicated fraud investigations, but it really taught me how to take notes and how to do a meticulous investigation. That period of time actually led to my promotion. And so I got promoted to sergeant in 1988, and I was sent in uniform, because you have to do your first year as a uniform sergeant in uniform, or as a sergeant in uniform as your probationary period. And then I went back into the detective office, and in 1990 I became a big city detective in 11th Division, which used to be at the corner of Dundas and Keele, but basically the High Park area of Toronto. An area that has a lot of wonderful houses, multi-million-dollar homes nowadays, but they also have Parkdale, which is a pretty rough area of Toronto. And so I had a real mix, a real blend of people to investigate. While I was there, I became a designated sexual assault investigator. At that time, the Toronto Police was looking to take their investigation of sex crimes into the 20th century, because we really were kind of locked in an old-fashioned kind of viewpoint, a very misogynistic viewpoint. Women were not the only victims of sexual assault. Men were often victims as well. And so I took some training and was designated by the chief of police to be a sexual assault investigator, which you had to have to be able to investigate what we called stranger-to-stranger investigations. Domestic investigations could be handled by regular detectives, but if it was a stranger to stranger, what you would classify as the old-fashioned rape, or what you would think of as rape, then you had to be designated. And of course, sex crimes, the whole concept of sex crimes had changed with the criminal code. Rape was no longer an offense, it was now sexual assault, because it wasn't a crime of sex, it was a crime of violence. And so that's what we really had to get our heads around. So I did that for a few years, and we talked at the table also about the problem of burnout and the effect of dealing with very traumatic circumstances. And within 4 years of being a sexual assault investigator, that was happening with me. And so I took an opportunity to move into another relatively stress-filled area of policing, and that was internal affairs. And so I went into internal affairs investigating police officers now. And so now I had to investigate misconduct and malfeasance by police officers. And so I worked in that unit for a couple of years. And then I wanted to get back into being a big city detective again. And a friend of mine said, well, have you ever thought of going into this brand new area of policing that really was being developed and had morphed from a very old-fashioned branch of the police service, the forensic service, or the identification service, which was just basically fingerprints and photographs, had now become the forensic identification service. And you may remember around this time there was a wonderful phenomenon that happened called CSI on TV. And everybody wanted to have a scientific crime scene unit, and that's what I went into. And so I ended up working there. I worked there for a number of years. My late wife, by that time I was divorced and remarried to my late wife, who worked at the Simcoe Manor in Beaton as an activity coordinator. And my late wife recognized that I was starting to get burnt out with the investigations that I was involved in, because I did 5 back-to-back child homicides in Toronto in the early 2000s. And so she suggested that I go to the Ontario Police College and teach, because it was something I always wanted to do. And we had a wonderful 2.5, almost 3 years there while I taught at the Ontario Police College. I left there and was going to retire, and I came back to Toronto, and by that time my position in the forensic unit had been filled, and so the chief said, well, we got a spot for you in the college here in Toronto. And at that time it was still in Scarborough, but it was planning to be moved to where it is now in Etobicoke. And I thought, praise God, my entire career I had to drive all the way to the far end of Scarborough to go to the police college, and now it's going to be in Etobicoke, very close to where I was living. And so I thought, I'm going to work there. What do you want me to do, Chief? And he said, well, you're the drum major of the pipe band. Remember I said I liked the bagpipes. And he says, so you know how to march, right? I said, yes. He goes, well, no other detectives can march, so I want you to become the sergeant major of the recruits. And I want you to teach these recruits how to march when they graduate, and I also want you to teach some of the things that you learned today. And I was at home in Tottenham when 911 happened, and I got a phone call from my boss, and he said, you're on standby. And I said, for what? He says, well, he says, believe it or not, he says, we have 2 identified targets in Toronto that the same cell of Al-Qaeda have targeted. And so we want you to be on standby in case there's an attack in the Toronto area. And so as it turns out, what had happened was when 911 happened, the chief of police at that time was Julian Fantino, and he got a phone call from the head of CSIS and the head of the RCMP and the head of the FBI, the special agent in charge of New York State, and he wanted to know what Toronto police was doing to get ready in case Toronto was attacked. And the chief went, I don't know. I think our SWAT team does something like that. And so he contacted the SWAT team, the Special Weapons Team, and the SWAT team unit commander said, well, we kind of do stuff like that, but you know what, the forensic guys, I think they've got a team. And the chief went, they do? He didn't even know that we had a team. And so he phoned our boss, and of course, our boss played a little dumb, and he went, oh yeah, we've had this team for a long time, Chief, we'll get them into play. He says, well, I want 2 teams to be standing by, because the CN Tower was identified as one target, the other target was the Royal Canadian Bank. Those were the 2 targets, and there was a cell of Al-Qaeda that was living on Jameson Avenue in Toronto, Jameson and King, and they had gone underground, and they were driving tractor trailers with dangerous goods. And one of them had gone into the company that he worked for and tried to take out a tanker that he was going to deliver to Buffalo, and he was going to crash into the Buffalo headquarters of the FBI. And the boss, for some reason, and to this day I don't think he really realized why he did this, but he said, no, there's just something hinky about this guy, and he wouldn't give him the load to take to the States. So fortunately, that tragedy never occurred. And these people eventually went underground and disappeared, and we eventually arrested some of the members of the cell a few years later, and you may remember when that happened. But at any rate, we had that investigation going on, and then the chief went, wow, we've got this team, so I guess we better get them trained. And so we started our training in earnest. And so we did things like we went to Alberta, and we trained with the British military and Canadian military in a military base in southern Alberta. I trained with live sarin and anthrax, and boy, that's scary stuff. When you sign a release that says if you get sick, you've got no comeback, and we can also try these experimental drugs on you to see if we can save you, and so you had to sign those documents. And anyways, it was quite a time. But the CBRNE team, and the E part is the explosive part, they've actually expanded to include them. They continue to this day. Death investigation was the big thing, of course. In Ontario, the Ontario Coroners Act, one of the most powerful pieces of legislation, directs people to investigate deaths. Now, one of the things I should mention right here, because people always say, oh yeah, I've got a granddaughter or a daughter or a son who's at University of Toronto or University of whatever, and they're taking forensics, and they're going to be a forensic investigator. Well, folks, to be a forensic investigator, you have to be a police officer. And so you have to be a police officer first. You can get all that training beforehand, there's nothing wrong with that. To work with the Center for Forensic Sciences, that's the Center for Forensic Sciences, and they have very specific areas: biology, toxicology, firearms and tool marks, chemistry, electronics, engineering, question documents, and video enhancements. And so if you don't fit into one of those areas, the Center for Forensic Sciences, there's one in Toronto, there's one in Thunder Bay. That's it. And so there's probably not more than about 150 scientists, because they've all got masters of science, and quite a number of them have PhDs. So to actually work in forensics in Canada is not as simple as you would in the States, where they hire civilian crime scene investigators. Now, there have been changes in legislation in the last few years, and we're trying to incorporate some more scientists into our crime scene to augment the police officers. But we know that to really understand what happens, the dynamics of a crime scene, you have to be a police officer first. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of the unit sections. The fingerprint section, I don't think I really need to say too much about that, except I'm going to put this picture up here, because that's a picture of, on the left is a partial print, and you can see it's just basically a half a fingerprint, and on the right is a rolled print. And a rolled print you can always tell because they're square, because you roll a finger from side to side, you get a nice rolled fingerprint. And if any of you have an iPhone, you know all about putting your finger on the iPhone thing and moving it back and forth until all of your identifiers are located. So what we do with those things, unlike what you think it happens on TV, the fingerprint is then mapped by the investigator. We have police officers that do this, we also have civilians. And then once it's mapped and all the little minutiae we call, all the little points of comparison are then logged, then we send that through the computer. And the computer kicks out, and there's a list of 6 there. There's actually about 30 possibilities that the computer says, well, there's a number of points of comparison here. But then it's up to the officer to actually find which one of those is the comparison. And in Canada, we have never had a court overturn fingerprint evidence. It's happened in the States where the qualifications for fingerprint examiners is not always as rigorous as it is up here, but in Canada it's never happened. And so fingerprint evidence is good. Fingerprint evidence is the best solitary identifier for a suspect. Better than DNA. People go, huh? Well, guess what? If you have a twin, anybody here a twin? Sometimes we have twins in the audience.
I have twins.
You have twins. Well, your twins share the same DNA.
Yes, they do.
And so if one of your twins, heaven forbid, should commit a crime and leave their DNA at the crime, the other twin, it could have been the one who actually did it. But they don't share fingerprints. Twins don't share fingerprints. So fingerprints are still the only single way of identifying a criminal at a crime scene. And when I started in forensics, we were just transitioning from actual photographs to computerized photographs and to digital photographs. And so the amount of photographs that we took at a crime scene, when we had to literally physically develop those rolls of film, went from, let's say someone was murdered in this room, I would conservatively take 300 or 400 pictures. Now with a digital camera, I'd come in and take 1,000, because it doesn't really matter. It's just information on a data bank. And so our collection of evidence became much larger and much bigger. And of course, then we needed servers with terabytes of information, not just gigabytes, and so that became problematic in itself. The computer-assisted recovery enhancement system, or CARES, is partly art and partly science. And so that's the unit that aged Elvis Presley to what he would look like nowadays. You've all seen those pictures of what Elvis would look like if he was alive. And so this unit, and this is an example that the officer, actually a civilian, who works in this unit, took a skull that was recovered in the York region a number of years ago. We had no idea who this person was. We knew it was a young lady. There was a little bit of hair left on the skull, and so she started to draw that skull. And which picture is that? That's the first picture. The next picture there is what she, and knowing the age of the skull, knowing basically what the hairstyles were in those days, and so that's what she ended up with, and that is who the young lady was. Pretty close. In fact, when that picture was published in the paper, her relatives came forward and said, "We think it's our daughter." And so the daughter was identified, and so the family was given some closure. The future, of course, we could have a whole talk about this, artificial intelligence, and AI is coming up with some incredible things. I was at a forum telling us about a case that he had, and he could talk about this, and he said it was something we could share with people. And it was a fellow that had been involved as the CEO of a company, and it was an international company, and he got a phone call one day from the president of the company back in China. And so he went online, and he ended up doing a Zoom call with this guy. And he had a conversation with his president and the vice president of the company, and they said, "Yeah, we're going to be making an acquisition of a new company somewhere in Canada, and we need you to transfer some money, and we need you to transfer $3 or $4 million just as a sign of good faith that we're going to make this purchase." And so he said, "No problem, and I'll send you the link where you send this money." Okay, so he got off the phone, and it was a Zoom call. He was looking at his boss. He got off the phone call, and so sure enough, he got the Zoom link the link for where he was going to send the money. And he looked at this thing and he thought, and I'm sure we've all seen those scam emails by now, and he thought, "I don't know about this." So he got on the phone and he phoned over to China, where the boss was working, and he said, "Did you just call me and tell me to transfer $3 million into this account?" The boss says, "I never talked to you this morning." He says, "Well, wasn't the vice president sitting there with you?" He says, "No, the vice president's at a convention in France. He's not even here." That was a completely AI-generated Zoom call. And so they had taken 20, and apparently as little as 20 seconds of video, and they can generate you doing just about anything. Committing a murder, committing a sexual assault, doing all kinds of heinous things, or even telling your bank president to transfer $1 million of your hard-earned money into some scam account somewhere. And so fortunately, he was able to stop that scam from happening. And 20 seconds of video, and apparently less than 5 seconds of audio. So my spoken voice. Patty's going to have lots of seconds of my audio, and you could generate all kinds of things coming out of my mouth. And so if there's something that somebody doesn't like in this talk, it was AI generated. I didn't actually say it. So that's something we have to be aware of for the future. One of the things that we do as forensic officers is we do footwear impressions as well. And there, of course, is the most famous footwear impression. Neil Armstrong on the moon, of course. But using snow plaster, it's called snow plaster, we can actually cast footwear impressions in the snow. And we can make identifications. In fact, I made an identification on a young man that was murdered, and his murderer stomped on his face as he left. And the young man was only 22 years of age, very sad case, and he was kept on life support because his family wanted to do organ donations. And the good thing about that, not that there was really anything good about that, but the good thing about that, because he was on life support for about 24 hours, is the bruising came out on his face. And the more the bruising came out, the more we were able to photograph the detail of the footwear that stomped on his face. And cross-contamination, of course, I just want to very briefly talk about that. Cross-contamination is something we always have to be worried about. OJ taught us that, so we'll always be vigilant. So I always laugh when you see crime scene investigations where the bad guy gets arrested and they bring him back to the scene and they say to the witness, "Is this the guy that did it?" That evidence would go nowhere in Canada because you've contaminated, first of all, he's come back to the scene. So any forensic trace evidence, they could say, well, is it possible that it was transferred from him coming back to the scene? Yes. And the identification of that guy, well, I'm holding up one person and I'm saying to you as the victim, is this the guy? Kind of doesn't give you any choices, right? So clearly that's not a proper identification. So that's some of the things that we have to be concerned about. So the journey continues now. How do I get from all of that horrible stuff and real scientific and policing stuff into the journey of faith? Well, believe it or not, and some of you have actually witnessed my production of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And Dickens' A Christmas Carol has a lot to do with why I am where I am today. And I'll tell you how it started that way. A good friend of mine who just died 2 weeks ago, he and I started the clans of Tecumseh Pipes and Drums in Tottenham, Ron Pueblo. And when Ron asked me to join the pipe band as a piper, I said I couldn't read a note to save my life, but I wouldn't mind becoming a drummer. And he says, well, as a matter of fact, we got a spot for drummers. He says, you're going to join as a drummer. He says, and we'll teach you. I said, okay, great. I'll join as a drummer. You join the Masonic Lodge. Because I was a past master at that point. And he said, okay. So he joined the lodge, and that connection has continued to this day because his son is also a Mason as well, and a good friend of mine. So anyway, that's how I got started with the pipe band. And Ron and I would travel all around Ontario, and we'd go to the Highland Games in Fergus and Orillia and all around, and we would listen to pipe tapes in his truck. And one of the pipe tapes we listened to was a pipe tape by the Calgary Highland Pipes and Drums in Calgary. And it's a former military regiment who gave up their charter and became a pipe band. And Jack White, a very famous author of medieval history, Jack White, W-H-Y-T-E, just passed away about 2 years ago. Jack White was their drum major, and he had come from Scotland and was working with the pipes and drums in Calgary, and he wrote two poems about battles that the Calgary Highlanders had won battle honors in World War I and World War II. World War I was the Battle of St. Julian's Woods, which is the first time the Germans used tear gas against the Allies, and it was a battle that the Canadians won. And as you probably know, if you know your Canadian history, we were pretty fearsome soldiers in both those world wars. The second one was from World War II, and it was the Battle of the Walcheren Causeway, and that took place in the Battle of the. I'm going to speak Dutch for a second because my adopted mother was Dutch. And that was the Battle of the Scheldt, or the Scheldt Estuary, and which was a very important geographical place in Europe, or in Holland, that the Allies wanted to take control of so that they could assist the coming D-Day. They knew D-Day was going to be coming soon, and so they really wanted to take control of that estuary. And so they had a huge battle there. And so Jack White wrote a poem about that battle, and it's about 13 minutes long, and if any of you have been to the Tottenham Legion, you may have heard me recite that poem. I recite it off by heart, and it became quite a tradition in Tottenham. And so I started to do that poem, and that was sort of at the same time as I was doing all of this other stuff with the pipe band. And my neighbor across the street, Gert Williams and her husband Tex, they said to me, well, you know, you do that Walcheren Causeway thing, how would you like to do Dickens? And I said, well, that sounds like a fun thing. And so I went to the Church of the Evangelists, the Anglican church, and I started to do the Dickens production along with the CBC. And we talked about that as well at breakfast. The CBC got involved with doing local productions of Dickens' A Christmas Carol as a way of supporting the local fundraising. And so I started to do that. Well, of course, now I'm in the church doing productions of Dickens' Christmas Carol, and the Anglican priest that was there, Naomi Miller, said to me, she says, well, Rob, she says, are you interested in coming to church? I said, yeah, I am, as a matter of fact. I really feel that this is a time in my life where I really need to come back to church, and I had been not a frequent attender, but I attended churches along the way. In fact, at one point, I was a member of an evangelical church in Toronto where I was the only white member. And so that was a wonderful experience, being a member of a church where all of the participants were from the Caribbean. And what a demonstrative, exuberant way of expressing your faith. But our theological differences got the better of us, and I left that church after a few years. But at any rate, I became involved with the Anglican Church and started to look at perhaps getting into their lay worship training, and that was around that time that my wife took ill and eventually passed. I was doing some of that training and continuing to do some pulpit supply at the Anglican Church and continuing to do the Dickens production. And about 2 years after my wife passed away, a good friend of mine from the lodge introduced me to a lady who was herself widowed, and she had been a member of St. James United in Stroud, and with her late husband. And so Maureen and I met, and 9 months later we got married. And so I've been fortunate to have had 3 wonderful ladies in my life to bless me with, because I'm still friends with my ex-wife, by the way. She and I could write a book on how to get divorced amicably. And so these 3 ladies really were the inspiration of my life, because right around that time as well, I discovered my birth mother. My birth mother lived in Kingston, and so that's Suzanne on the left, my adopted mother, Keek, or Hendrika, in the middle there, and my late wife, Pat, on the right. And so those 3 ladies were really my inspiration, and my inspiration in faith. And so I started to explore that. And at the same time, interestingly enough, my mother, who at this point was in Toronto in a nursing home, ended up in Cobourg. My family ended up having to put her into a nursing home in Cobourg. And I was down there talking with her one day, and Pat said to me, she says, "Have you ever told your mother that wonderful poem that you read, or that you recite?" And I said, "No." My mother said, "What poem?" And my mother's memory was, as like a lot of dementia patients, her recent memory was terrible, but she could remember a lot of things from a long time ago. And I said, let me recite it for you, Mom. And so I recited it for her. And I wasn't even looking at her, I was just kind of lost in the moment reciting it. And I turned to look at her, and the tears were just streaming down her face. And she said, "Robbie," she called me Robbie. She said, "Robbie," she says, "I was there." Like I said, she was Dutch. She was near that battle in the south of Holland, in Vlissingen, when the Battle of the Walcheren Causeway took place. And she remembers clearly that October night in 1944 when the Allies stormed and took that causeway. And she says, "And as a matter of fact, Robbie, you and I have walked on that causeway." And I just about was knocked over, and I said, "What?" She says, "When I was 11 years old, many years ago, I had gone to Holland with my mom and to visit my grandmother, my Oma. And so we had gone to the south of Holland, and we had actually walked on that causeway just to walk on some history and see the pillboxes that were still there, the gun embattlements that the Germans had built." And she says, "You and I have walked on that causeway. That causeway is now about 300 feet underneath the North Sea, because the Dutch have reclaimed some of the land on the other side of it and flooded that area, and so that will never be walked on again." And so that was kind of startling for me. I had no idea that I had a personal connection to that. So life takes a turn, and I meet Maureen. That is Maureen and I getting married. We got married in the Masonic Lodge in Barrie. Reverend William Houghton married us. He was the minister at Collier Street United, and Collier Street United became very central to my faith and to my faith journey. And the fellow on the far right is the Reverend Hewitt Holmes, who just left Collier. He's now doing his PhD at the university in Vancouver. So I became a licensed lay worship leader. Licensed lay worship leader, 4 6-month courses, I started to take them, and within about 6 or 7 months into the course, I said to Reverend Dr. Christine Smaller, who was one of my instructors, I said to Christine, I said, I need more than this. God's calling me into deeper service than being a lay worship leader. Not that there's anything wrong with being a lay worship leader. Pat Edmonds, my dear friend, is one of the senior lay worship leaders in this region. But I said, I feel called into deeper service. And so she said, well, have you ever heard of diaconia? I said, diaconia? Well, it's diaconia or diaconia. We really can't decide how to pronounce that word because it's a Greek word, and it talks about service. And it's a program that grew out of the old deacon program, or deaconess program actually, back when women were not ordained in the United Church. And so in 1925 at the Union of the Churches that we'll be celebrating this year, they had ministers who were ordained, and they had deaconesses for women who wanted to serve the church. And you couldn't be married. So a number of the deaconesses who became deaconesses, when they got married, they had to leave that service. They could still be members of the church and members of the UCW and all those kinds of things, but a very misogynistic attitude that we had in the good old United Church. And so of course, as time went on and women rallied and fought for equality and recognition as leaders in the church, as we got into the 50s and 60s, women started to be ordained. And so the deaconess program sort of morphed, and men came along and said, hey, if you can be deaconesses, why can't we be deacons? And so men were introduced into the program as well. And so the Center for Christian Studies, which was attached to Emmanuel College at University of Toronto, eventually in the 80s moved to Winnipeg and became the Center for Christian Studies there, and a center for deaconess and deacon education in not only the United Church of Canada, but also the Anglican Church, because Anglican priests start out as deacons quite often. And you'll graduate as a deacon in the Anglican Church and then be called into ministry and be ordained. So that was fine. I was told about that, and I said, well, what's the big deal about diaconal? Why can't I be an ordained minister? They said, well, ordained's wonderful, but the diaconal ministry focuses on three pillars of the church: pastoral care, talking with people and helping them in times of need; education, which was right up my alley; and social justice, which to a retired police officer was right up my alley. And I said, well, that sounds like a good fit. And quite frankly, I don't want to drive all the way to Toronto anymore. I'm tired of driving south of Highway 9. 88 in Beaton is about, or Bondhead is about as far south as I want to go, unless I'm going to a show at the Princess of Wales or something. But I said, yeah, that sounds good, but where do I have to go for that training? Well, you have to go to Winnipeg. I said, Winnipeg? Oh my goodness, I don't know if I want to go to Winnipeg. But it was the kind of thing that's done in blocks and what they call intensives. And a lot of universities done this way too. And so you go for 10 courses. You also have to do university level courses as well. And then you have to do field training. And so it usually takes anywhere from 4 to 5 years. I did it in 5 years because I wasn't sure if I could handle the academic stuff. And I started into the academic training, and COVID hit. And COVID was actually my friend, because now instead of flying to Winnipeg 3 or 4 times a year and renting a B&B or an apartment or getting into some sort of shared accommodation, I could now do all my courses online. And so I did all my courses online, and I did all my university courses online, because I started to take my university level courses at St. Stephen's College, the University of Alberta. And I took 2 courses, did really well, and I got a phone call from the dean. And the dean said to me, and as soon as she opened her mouth, I said, "You're Dutch." And she says, "How do you know?" I said, "Well, because my mother was Dutch." And so right away we had this connection. And she said, "Well, as a matter of fact, the reason I'm calling you is you don't have an undergrad, do you?" I said, "No, I don't." Well, you have a lot of lived experience. a lot of incredible lived experience, and you have had lots of training with the Toronto Police and throughout your whole career as an educator as well. And we would like to offer you the opportunity of getting your master's degree. And I said, well, what do I have to do for that? Well, you have to take 2 extra courses and you have to write a thesis. That's it? And I can get a master's degree? She said, that's it. So I did that. And so I've now finished all of that training, and I'm now in the process of finishing my master's thesis, which happens to be on Mary, the mother of Jesus, an interesting topic. So that's what I'm doing now. And so even though I've graduated as a diaconal minister and have been not ordained, but commissioned, because diaconal ministers don't get ordained, we get commissioned, and commissioned into the service. And the interesting thing is diaconal ministers now, they weren't back even 10 years ago, but now they do exactly the same job as designated lay ministers, as ordained ministers. We're all equal in the eyes of the church. We all have the same pay scale, we all have the same benefits and all the wonderful things that go along with that. And we're considered the congregational leaders of our churches. And so that was wonderful. And so that's why I got into the whole diaconal program. There's the diaconia. I say diaconia, some say diaconia. Diaconia of the United Church of Canada, and you can see by the red letters on the left, D-U-C-C. And so we affectionately call ourselves ducks. And so my newsletter that I put out, Patty puts out her newsletter every week. I put out a newsletter called Duck News at St. James and Stroud. And I wasn't there a month, and the congregation went out and bought me a ceramic yellow duck that sits on my desk now. It's a candy dish. And so ducks. And then of course I got a gift at Christmas time from somebody with a mug with a duck on it. And so now I guess I'm going to end up getting ducks for the rest of my life. And so now I'm at St. James United in Stroud. I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to come out. I've got a wonderful day ahead of me, and I just want to thank you and thank Pastor Patty for the opportunity to come out. Thanks, guys.
Just get a shot of everybody who was here. Thanks, Rob, so much for coming and sharing. Oh my gosh, there's so many stories.
Oh, there is.
Unfortunately, the record button went off a couple of times, so I'm going to miss some of what you said, and I might edit out some of the more graphic parts and put a warning graphic material ahead when I put the video together, and we're going to upload it so that the women of our congregation can share. There's quite a controversy here a couple of weeks ago because the women all wanted to be here.
I hear they even bribed you with
Butter tarts.
Butter tarts.
Boy, you guys have got stern stuff to be able to refuse those.
I didn't start it, the lady started.
So, great
Yep,
stuff.
so there's some questions?
Questions, yes.
I just have a question, Rob. And how do you see the police handling all the problems that they're getting from the internet now? All the backlash against policing and the police and the lack of respect that's coming through for the police. How are they handling that?
I think that's a reflection of society, quite frankly. I mean, we're seeing a lack of respect in all aspects of society. Pastor Patty talked about it in her newsletter with the Right Reverend Marion Buddy, who spoke at the inauguration of the 47th president, where we're talking, it almost seems like society's been given permission to disrespect each other, and regardless of whether you're on this side of the political spectrum or that side of the political spectrum, it used to be that we could all agree to disagree or meet in the middle sometimes, and very similar things happening with policing. And now, mind you, looking back on it as an outsider, can I tell you that there are things that need to be criticized in policing? Certainly, the criminal justice system. I can tell you the way we handled the LGBT community was absolutely terrible. Whether you agree with with lifestyles, whether you agree with political positions, your job is to serve the community equal. Fortunately, I didn't see a lot of overt racism, although there was certainly a lot of systemic racism that takes place even in this country. But I think what's going to happen, to answer your question, is you're going to see the pendulum swing. And the pendulum has swung so far to one side that I'm hoping, certainly with our efforts as Christians, with our efforts as leaders of our community, we can encourage the community to start bringing that pendulum back towards the center, where at least we don't have to go to the left. We don't have to be woke, like these people on the right seem to say that's a bad word. I happen to like being woke, but at least if we can get into the center where we all deal with each other with a modicum of respect, and where, you know, I don't have to agree with your lifestyle or anyone's lifestyle or anyone's political bent, but darn it all, I have to certainly be respectful. And the whole idea that, if I use a word that we kind of are familiar with in ministry, and that's the other. You know, the whole idea of the others. You know, get out of that idea that there are others. There are no others. We are all together. You know, there are no Greek or Jew. You know, there are no slave or free, as the good book tells us.